Queens, New York, Cozy Corner Bar on Atlantic Avenue in South Ozone Park. Friday evening, March 21st, 1986. A neighborhood bar that served as informal meeting place for Gambino family and for local residents, who understood that certain conversations at certain tables weren't meant to be overheard, where the atmosphere was working-class friendly during early evening hours, when legitimate customers came for drinks after work shifts, where the back room was reserved for more serious business that couldn't be conducted in public view, where the owner maintained careful balance between running a profitable, legitimate bar and accommodating organized crime figures whose patronage ensured that no trouble ever occurred inside his establishment, because everyone understood that fighting in a mob-connected bar was how you got seriously hurt. At a table near the front window, visible to anyone walking past on Atlantic Avenue, sat John Gotti, 45 years old, boss of the Gambino crime family. For approximately 3 months, since orchestrating Paul Castellano's murder outside Sparks Steakhouse in December 1985, someone who was still consolidating his control over the family, still demonstrating to capos and soldiers that his leadership would be different from Castellano's distant businessman approach, still showing that he was accessible and present in neighborhood locations rather than isolated in Staten Island mansions, still building the public image that would eventually make him the most famous mob boss in American history. Gotti was conducting business that Friday evening, meeting with 3 capos to discuss family operations, speaking quietly but intensely about matters that required face-to-face conversation, rather than phone calls that might be monitored, enjoying the atmosphere of a neighborhood bar that reminded him of his roots in street-level organized crime, rather than the corporate approach that Castellano had tried to impose, demonstrating leadership style that emphasized visibility and accessibility rather than distance and formality. At approximately 8:15 p.m., a man entered the Cozy Corner Bar who immediately drew attention from everyone present. Drew attention because of his sheer physical size, because he was approximately 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed somewhere around 300 pounds of obvious muscle mass, because he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent years building extraordinary strength through systematic weight training, because his arms were thicker than most people's legs, and his chest strained against a shirt that seemed inadequate to contain the physique beneath it, because he represented physical intimidation at levels that most people never encountered, that made normal-sized humans feel small and vulnerable by comparison. The man was Tommy Marconi, 32 years old, a professional bodybuilder who'd competed in regional competitions and who'd built local reputation as someone who could handle security work and debt collection through physical presence alone. Someone whose size meant that most people complied with demands without requiring actual violence. Someone who'd never lost a fight because opponents took one look at his physique and decided that fighting him was suicide. Marconi had been successful in his security and collection work precisely because his appearance was so intimidating that actual physical confrontation was rarely necessary, because showing up and standing silently near someone who owed money was usually sufficient to ensure immediate payment. But Marconi's success through physical intimidation had created a blind spot, had taught him that size was power, that being bigger and stronger than everyone else meant he could operate without concern for who he confronted or what organizational affiliations they had, that his 300 pounds of muscle was protection against consequences that might affect normal-sized people who had to rely on intelligence or connections rather than on pure physical dominance. Marconi had been hired by a local businessman to collect a debt from someone who regularly drank at the Cozy Corner Bar, had been given description of the debtor and told that Friday evenings were the best time to find him, had entered the bar looking for his target, but had instead noticed John Gotti sitting at a table near the window, had recognized Gotti from newspaper photos and television coverage, and had made a decision that demonstrated catastrophic misunderstanding about how power actually worked in organized crime environments. Marconi walked directly to Gotti's table, positioned himself so that his physical size was maximally intimidating, so that Gotti had to look up at someone who towered over him and who outweighed him by approximately 150 pounds, and spoke in a voice that was loud enough that everyone in the bar could hear, that was clearly intended as public challenge designed to demonstrate that Marconi wasn't intimidated by mob reputation, that physical size trumped organizational power. "John Gotti," Marconi said, his voice carrying aggressive confidence that came from decades of watching people back down when confronted with his physical presence. "I've been hearing about you, reading about you in the papers. Everyone's talking about how you're the new boss of the Gambino family, how you're so dangerous, how everyone's supposed to be afraid of you. But looking at you now, sitting here in this bar, you don't look so dangerous to me. You look like a small man in an expensive suit who's gotten by on reputation rather than on anything real. I bet without your bodyguards and your gun and your organization, you're just another little guy who'd get destroyed in any actual physical confrontation." The bar went completely silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The bartender stopped moving. Every patron turned to stare because Tommy Marconi had just publicly challenged John Gotti, had insulted him by calling him small, had suggested that Gotti's power was illusory rather than real, had made statements that required response because not responding would mean accepting humiliation in front of witnesses who would report this encounter throughout Queens and beyond. Gotti's three capos immediately reached for weapons, understanding that their boss had been insulted, that this situation required violence, that Marconi needed to be dealt with immediately and brutally to demonstrate that challenging John Gotti carried lethal consequences. But Gotti held up his hand, stopped his capos from drawing weapons, and did something that witnesses later described as both the most confident and the most frightening response possible to physical intimidation. John Gotti laughed, a genuine, delighted laugh that filled the silent bar, that showed he found this entire situation amusing rather than threatening, that demonstrated he viewed Marconi's physical challenge as irrelevant rather than a serious confrontation, that indicated Gotti understood something about power that Marconi clearly didn't comprehend. "Tommy Marconi," Gotti said, still smiling, his voice carrying amusement that was somehow more intimidating than anger would have been. 300 pounds of muscle. Professional bodybuilder. I've heard about you. You collect debts for local businessmen. You do security work. You intimidate people with your size. And you've been successful at it because most people you confront are just regular guys who don't know how to handle someone your size, who look at you and decide that paying the debt or complying with demands is easier than fighting you. That's a good business model. That's smart. Use your advantages. I respect that. Gotti leaned back in his chair, took a sip of his drink, maintained eye contact with Maronei, who was still standing, still trying to project intimidation through physical presence. But Tommy, here's what you don't understand. Here's the lesson you're about to learn that will either make you smarter or will get you killed, depending on how quickly you comprehend what I'm telling you. Size doesn't matter in my world. Being 300 pounds doesn't matter. Being stronger than everyone else doesn't matter. You know why? Because I'm not going to fight you. I'm never going to fight you. If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't stand up and trade punches with you. I'd have my guys shoot you. If I wanted you hurt, I wouldn't challenge you to arm wrestling or whatever it is you think physical confrontation looks like. I'd have people break your legs while you sleep. Size is irrelevant when confronting people who understand that power comes from organization, from loyalty, from being willing to use methods that don't depend on personal physical strength. Maronei's expression began to change, the confidence fading as he started to process what Gotti was saying, started to understand that the framework he'd used successfully for years, size equals power, physical dominance equals control, didn't apply in this situation. That he'd walked into an environment where his advantages meant nothing and where his challenge had put him in danger he hadn't anticipated. Gotti continued, his voice still friendly, but now carrying an edge that made everyone listening understand that this was serious education rather than casual conversation. You walked in here and challenged me publicly, called me small, suggested I'm only powerful because of my organization and my weapons, like that's some kind of weakness rather than the entire point. You thought your 300 pounds would intimidate me. You thought I'd be impressed or frightened by your size. You fundamentally misunderstood how power works in my world. Gotti stood up, his 5'10" frame obviously much smaller than Maronei's 6'4" physique, the size difference making Gotti's complete lack of fear even more striking, making it clear that Gotti genuinely didn't view Maronei's physical advantages as relevant to this interaction. Here's what's going to happen, Tommy. You're going to apologize for insulting me. You're going to apologize loudly enough that everyone in this bar hears you acknowledge that you made a mistake. And then you're going to leave and you're going to spend the rest of your life being grateful that I found your ignorance amusing rather than offensive, that I decided to teach you rather than kill you, that I'm giving you an opportunity to walk out of here alive because I respect that you didn't know better rather than because you deserve mercy. Maronei stood frozen, understanding now that he'd made a catastrophic error, that his physical size provided no protection against mob authority, that Gotti's laughter had been far more frightening than anger would have been, because it demonstrated complete confidence, that challenging John Gotti in a bar filled with Gambino associates was effectively suicide for someone who had no organizational backing or protection. "I apologize," Marconi said, his voice now lacking all the aggressive confidence it had carried moments earlier, his entire demeanor showing submission and fear. "Mr. Gotti, I apologize. I didn't understand. I made a mistake. I'm sorry for insulting you. I'm sorry for what I said. Please, I didn't mean any real disrespect." Gotti smiled again, a warmer smile now, showing that he genuinely appreciated Marconi's apology and his recognition of error. "Good. That shows intelligence, Tommy. That shows you're capable of learning. Now listen carefully, because this is important and could save your life someday. Size is an advantage in certain situations. In bar fights, security work, intimidating regular people who don't know how to handle physical confrontation. In those situations, being 300 pounds of muscle is valuable. But when you're dealing with organized crime, when you're in environments where people have guns and organizations and no moral qualms about using lethal violence, size becomes irrelevant. Actually, it becomes a disadvantage because it makes you overconfident, makes you think you're invincible when really you're just big. Gotti sat back down, picked up his drink, took another sip before continuing. "You want to keep working as bodybuilder and debt collector and security guy? Fine. Do that. Be successful at it. But stay away from mob business. Don't collect debts from people who are connected. Don't confront people in bars where organized crime does business. And for the love of God, don't ever again walk up to someone like me and challenge them based on size comparison. That's how you get killed. That's how 300 pounds of muscle ends up dead in an alley because you thought being big protected you from people who understand that power has nothing to do with physical strength." Gotti made a dismissive, a gesture. "Now leave. Go back to your regular life. Remember this lesson. And be grateful that I found you amusing rather than insulting. Because if I'd taken offense rather than being entertained, your size wouldn't have saved you. You'd be dead within hours regardless of how strong you are or how many fights you've won against regular people who don't have the resources and the ruthlessness to simply shoot anyone who becomes a problem." Marconi left the cozy corner bar immediately, walked out, understanding that his entire framework for understanding power had been demolished in 5 minutes. That physical size meant nothing when confronting organizational power. That John Gotti's laughter had been more devastating than any physical beating could have been because it demonstrated that Marconi's greatest advantage was viewed as completely irrelevant by people who operated at levels where violence was systematic rather than personal, where problems were solved through methods that didn't require physical strength or fighting ability. The story of Tommy Marconi's confrontation with John Gotti spread through Queens within hours, became legend that illustrated several important lessons about power and intimidation, and the difference between physical dominance and organizational authority. The story focused particularly on Gotti's laughter, on his amusement rather than anger, on his willingness to educate rather than kill, on his complete confidence that Marconi's 300 pounds of muscle posed no threat whatsoever because Gotti understood that real power came from organization and from willingness to use lethal violence rather than from personal physical capability. For Tommy Marconi, the encounter was transformative. He continued working as bodybuilder and security professional, continued using his size to intimidate people in legitimate contexts, but he never again attempted to confront organized crime figures, never again made the mistake of assuming that physical advantages translated to protection against people who had access to weapons and organizations and systematic violence that rendered size irrelevant. Marconi later told friends that John Gotti's laughter haunted him, that understanding how completely his challenge had been dismissed, how utterly his framework for power had been demolished, had taught him more about real danger than any physical fight ever had, that recognizing the difference between being strong and being powerful had probably saved his life because it had taught him to recognize situations where his advantages didn't apply and where continued aggressive behavior would result in death rather than compliance. The broader significance of the March 1986 encounter was that it demonstrated something important about John Gotti's character and his understanding of power. Gotti could have responded to Marconi's challenge with immediate violence, could have had his associates beat or kill Marconi for the public. Insult could have made an example that would have been brutal and straightforward. Instead, Gotti chose education, chose to explain why Marconi's challenge was irrelevant, chose to demonstrate power through confidence and explanation rather than through violence. This response served multiple purposes. It showed everyone watching that Gotti was secure enough in his power that physical challenges didn't threaten him, that he could afford to be amused by confrontations that would have angered less confident leaders, that his authority came from organizational capability rather than from personal fighting ability. It also demonstrated mercy that built loyalty and respect. Gotti could have killed Marconi, but chose to educate him instead, showing that Gotti understood the difference between threats that required lethal response and mistakes that could be corrected through explanation. The story became part of Gotti's mythology, was retold alongside stories about his violence and his ruthlessness, provided balance that showed Gotti as someone who was confident enough to laugh at physical challenges, who understood power deeply enough that he didn't need to prove anything through violence when education would suffice, who could choose mercy without appearing weak because his power was so absolute, that choosing not to kill someone was itself a demonstration of authority. Friday evening, March 21st, 1986, at the Cozy Corner Bar on Atlantic Avenue. The night Tommy Marconi, 300 pounds of professional bodybuilder muscle, confronted John Gotti with a challenge based on physical size comparison, suggesting that Gotti was just a small man whose power came from organization rather than from anything real. The laugh that responded, that showed Gotti found the challenge amusing rather than threatening, that demonstrated Gotti's complete confidence that physical size was irrelevant when confronting someone who understood that power came from organization and systematic violence rather than from personal fighting ability. The education that followed explaining why size didn't matter in organized crime, why 300 pounds of muscle provided no protection against people with guns and organizations and willingness to use lethal violence, why Marconi's challenge was based on fundamental misunderstanding about how power actually worked in mob environments. The apology that Marconi delivered, after understanding how completely he'd miscalculated. The mercy that Gotti showed by allowing Marconi to leave rather than having him killed for public insult. The legend that spread about the night a bodybuilder challenged a mob boss and received laughter in response. Laughter that was more intimidating than anger. Laughter that demonstrated power so complete that physical challenges were amusing rather than threatening. Laughter that taught Marconi and everyone watching that size was advantage only in certain contexts, and that confronting organized crime based on physical intimidation was how you got killed, regardless of how strong you were. March 21st, 1986. The giant who didn't understand power. The mob boss who laughed. The lesson delivered through explanation rather than violence. The mercy shown that demonstrated authority more effectively than killing would have. The story that became legend about the night John Gotti proved that real power had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with organization, with loyalty, with understanding when and how to use violence rather than relying on personal physical capability. What happened when 300 pounds of muscle confronted 5 feet 10 inches of organizational power and discovered that size meant nothing? That laughter was more frightening than threats. That education could be more devastating than violence. That walking away alive from John Gotti was mercy rather than weakness. And that the lesson learned that night probably saved Tommy Marconi's life by teaching him to recognize situations where his physical advantages didn't apply and where continued aggression would result in death rather than compliance.